In 1847, the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains were a silent wilderness of towering pines and rushing cold water. For centuries, only the indigenous Nissenan people walked these quiet valleys, hunting along the banks of the American River. But a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter wanted to carve out his own empire in this untouched land. He envisioned a massive agricultural colony, a place he called New Helvetia. To build his dream, Sutter needed wood, millions of board feet of lumber. So, he hired a quiet, eccentric carpenter from New Jersey named James W. Marshall. Marshall traveled up the South Fork of the American River to a small valley called Coloma. There, he began construction on a water-powered sawmill, deep in the heart of the wilderness. By January of 1848, the mill was nearly finished, but the water channel, the tail race, was too shallow. Every night, Marshall opened the floodgates to let the rushing river wash away the loose dirt and gravel. On the cold morning of January 24, 1848, Marshall walked down to the tail race to inspect the progress. The morning sun was just peeking over the mountain ridges, casting a bright glare on the wet stones. As Marshall looked into the clear, shallow water, something caught his eye. Deep in the gravel, beneath 6 inches of icy water, a glittery speck was reflecting the morning light. He reached his hand into the freezing river and picked up a piece of metal about the size of a pea. It was remarkably heavy and had a dull, rich yellow color. Marshall felt his heart beat faster, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that had broken many men's hearts. He took the metal piece and hammered it between 2 rocks. Instead of shattering into dust like pyrite, the metal easily bent and reshaped without breaking. Marshall ran back to the mill, shouting to his small crew of workers that he had found gold. The men gathered around, skeptical, testing the metal in a pot of boiling lye. The yellow metal emerged from the chemical bath shining brighter than before. 4 days later, Marshall rode his horse through a pouring rainstorm back to Sutter's fort in Sacramento. He burst into Sutter's private office, drenched to the skin and dripping wet. Marshall locked the heavy wooden door behind him and insisted they speak in absolute secrecy. With trembling hands, Marshall pulled a rag from his pocket and untied the knot. Inside were several small, heavy yellow flakes. Sutter, a highly educated man, fetched his encyclopedia and ran a series of chemical tests on the metal. He applied nitric acid to the yellow flakes, but they did not tarnish. He weighed them. Sutter looked up from his desk, his face pale with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. It was 23-karat gold, virtually pure. Sutter did not celebrate. Instead, a deep sense of dread washed over him. He knew that if the world found out about this gold, his agricultural empire would be ruined. Thousands of desperate men would overrun his lands, destroy his crops, and steal his cattle. Sutter gathered his workers and made them swear a solemn oath of secrecy for 6 weeks. But a secret this massive, buried in the dirt of a riverbed, could never stay hidden for long. Within days, whispers and the rivers. And very soon, a single spark in the wilderness would ignite the greatest migration in human history. In May of 1859, a prospector named James Finney made a discovery that would trigger one of the wildest stampedes in American history. Finney, nicknamed Old Virginie, was searching the rugged slopes of Mount Davidson in present-day Nevada. He noticed a strange, dark, bluish-black soil blocking his gold washing pan. To any ordinary digger, this heavy mud was just an annoying nuisance that clogged up their equipment. But what Finney had actually stumbled upon was a massive vein of near-pure silver ore. This hidden treasure would soon be known to the world as the legendary Comstock Lode. Within weeks, the whisper of silver spread like wildfire through the California gold fields. Tens of thousands of Sierra Nevada mountains. They called this frantic exodus the rush to Washoe. These men were not seasoned pioneers, they were desperate dreamers looking to strike it rich overnight. They traveled on foot, on mules, and in rickety wagons, braving freezing mountain passes and blistering desert heat. Many of them had survived the California gold rush, only to find themselves broke and desperate a decade later. They believed this new territory was their second chance at a fortune. As the masses descended upon the eastern slope of Mount Davidson, a chaotic tent city began to materialize out of the sagebrush. They called this lawless settlement Virginia City, named in honor of James Finney himself. At first, the wooden shacks and crude dirt dugouts. There were no roads, no laws, and absolutely no order. Water was scarce, often tasting of arsenic and sulfur from the nearby geothermal springs. Yet, the prospectors kept coming, driven by a pure, blinding fever. Men slept 10 to a room in drafty boarding houses, paying premium prices just for a patch of floor. Gambling dens and makeshift saloons popped up overnight, built from rough-hewn pine boards. Whiskey flowed faster than water, and arguments were routinely settled with a Colt revolver. Among the early arrivals was a young, unsuccessful miner named Samuel Clemens. Clemens quickly realized that digging for silver was backbreaking, miserable work with no guarantees. Instead of a job at the local newspaper, the Territorial Enterprise. It was here, in the smoky offices of Virginia City, that he first used his famous pen name, Mark Twain. Twain wrote about the madness surrounding him, capturing the raw, untamed spirit of the boomtown. He described a place where silver was so abundant that people walked on streets paved with discarded ore. The earth beneath Virginia City was being hollowed out at an unprecedented rate. But mining the Comstock Lode was vastly different from panning for gold in California streams. This silver was locked deep inside solid quartz veins, requiring heavy machinery and immense capital to extract. Individual miners soon realized they could not compete with the wealthy syndicates arriving from San Francisco. These powerful financiers bought up the claims, turning the lawless camp into a massive industrial complex. They brought in hours a day, filling the canyon with a deafening roar. The hillsides were stripped bare of timber to support the vast network of underground tunnels. The mines grew deeper, hotter, and incredibly dangerous. Deep inside the earth, temperatures reached over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Scalding water would suddenly burst from the rock walls, boiling men alive where they stood. To prevent the collapsing of these deep shafts, a German engineer named Philipp Deitscheimer invented a revolutionary timbering system. He created the square-set timbering method, locking heavy wooden beams together like a massive honeycomb. This brilliant engineering marvel allowed miners to dig deeper than ever before, turning Virginia City into the richest city in America. By the mid-1860s, the town boasted grand brick buildings, luxury hotels, and even an opera house. Millionaires walked the boardwalks, their pockets lined with the silver of the Comstock. It had transformed from a desolate mountain outpost into a glittering oasis of wealth and excess. But this sudden, glittering prosperity had a dark side that was about to unleash a wave of violence. By the summer of 1877, Deadwood was no longer just a chaotic cluster of tents tucked away in the gulch. The dirt pathways that once wound around pine stumps had been beaten flat by thousands of desperate boots. In their place rose a sprawling, chaotic metropolis built entirely out of fresh-cut canvas and green timber. The scent of freshly sawn ponderosa pine hung heavy in the mountain air, mixed with the pungent stench of horse manure and cheap whiskey. Every single day, the hillsides echoed with the relentless crash of axes and the high-pitched scream of steam-powered sawmills. If you stood on the ridge overlooking the town, you would see a sea of white canvas roofs shimmering in the sun. These tent saloons and canvas hotels were erected in a matter of hours to house the endless flood of new arrivals. But this was a fragile empire of wood and cloth. One careless spark from a wood stove or a dropped kerosene lamp could reduce the entire city to ash in minutes. Yet, everyone was too busy chasing the yellow glitter buried deep beneath the rocks. Main Street became a dense, choking bottleneck of heavy freight wagons, braying mules, and mud-splattered prospectors. At the center of this madness stood a man named Swearengen. Swearengen was not a freezing streams. He understood that the easiest way to strike it rich was to mine the gold directly from the pockets of the miners themselves. In May of 1877, he opened the doors to the infamous Gem Variety Theater. It was not just a theater, it was a massive, multi-level palace of vice that never closed its doors. The gem offered cheap theater acts, heavily watered-down whiskey, and private rooms lining the upper balcony. Swearengen imported young women from eastern cities, promising them respectable jobs in the West, only to force them into labor upon arrival. On any given night, the gem raked in over $5,000 in gold dust. That is the equivalent of over $100,000 today. While Swearengen ruled the entertainment district, other entrepreneurs focused on the basic necessities of survival. A single egg in Deadwood could cost you $1, which was a full day's wage in the eastern states. A clean glass of water was often harder to find, and much more expensive, than a shot of rotgut whiskey. The water in the gulch was quickly turning into a toxic sludge of mercury, dirt, and human waste. Yet, the lack of sanitation did not slow down the construction boom. Behind the flimsy canvas fronts, permanent brick and stone structures were beginning to take root. The legendary merchant Seth Bullock arrived with a wagon load of hardware and immediately saw the town's potential. Bullock did not search for gold, he sold the shovels, the nails, and the frying pans that made the search possible. He and his business partner, Solstar, quickly built a thriving hardware empire on Main Street. They watched as the canvas tents were slowly replaced by two-story wooden buildings with false fronts designed to make the town look grander than it was. But this rapid growth occurred in a complete legal vacuum. Deadwood was built on land that technically belonged to the Great Sioux Reservation, established by the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Because the town was illegal under federal law, there was no United States government presence, no courts, and no police. The only law that mattered was the law of the gun and the strength of your own fists. In the saloons, disputes over mining claims were settled with a quick draw or a bloody brawl on the sawdust floor. Despite the lawlessness, a strange kind of order began to emerge from the chaos. The business owners formed a board of health to address the growing threat of cholera and smallpox. They hired men to clear the dead animals and garbage from the center of the streets. They knew that if profits would vanish overnight. By the end of the year, the canvas metropolis had transformed into a bustling, permanent city of wood and stone. But the ground beneath this new empire was far from stable. As the winter winds began to howl through the gulch, a new threat emerged from the shadows of the surrounding pine forests. For all its wealth and rapid growth, Deadwood was about to face a reckoning that no amount of gold could prevent. But a sudden scream from the edge of town would soon change the fate of the entire valley. By 1877, the dirt roads of Tombstone, Arizona were no longer just quiet desert paths. The silver boom had arrived, and with it came a flood of fortune seekers, gamblers, and outlaws. Every single night, the glowing lanterns of Allen Street lit up a world of pure chaos. You see, in a town growing this fast, the law was nothing but a thin badge pinned to a nervous man's chest. The local saloons never locked their doors because the drinking and gambling simply never stopped. In the smoke-filled rooms of the Birdcage Theater, miners threw down silver coins while performers sang on stage. Here, a man could lose his entire life savings in a single hand of faro. And if a dispute broke out, the argument was the territory of the cowboys, a loose gang of cattle rustlers who ruled the county with intimidation. Men like Ike Clanton and Frank McClory openly defied any authority that dared to cross them. They rode through the streets, firing their pistols into the air just to watch the townspeople run for cover. But the business owners of Tombstone were getting tired of the constant lawlessness ruining their profits. They needed someone tough enough to stand up to the chaos, someone who did not scare easily. So, they turned to a family of brothers with a reputation for cold, calculated steel. Virgil Earp took the job of town marshal, and he quickly deputized his brothers, Wyatt and Morgan. The Earps did not play by the rules of the desert, they brought a strict, iron-fisted order to the streets. Wyatt Earp, with his cold blue eyes and long mustache, became a shadow over the town's criminal underworld. He walked the wooden boardwalks with a heavy cane, ready to strike down anyone who broke the peace. Then came Doc Holliday, a deadly, coughing dentist from Georgia who loved gambling and hated the cowboys. Doc was loyal only to Wyatt, and his quick temper made him the most dangerous man in the territory. The tension between the Earp faction and the cowboy gang grew tighter with every passing week. The cowboys claimed the Earps were abusing their power to protect their own business interests. The Earps claimed the cowboys were a disease that needed to be cut out of Arizona for good. It was a classic powder keg, waiting for a single spark to blow the entire town apart. That spark finally ignited on a freezing, windy. A group of armed cowboys gathered in a narrow, 15-foot alleyway near the OK Corral. They were complaining about the new gun laws that Virgil Earp had just put into place. Virgil decided it was time to disarm the gang once and for all, marching down Fremont Street to confront them. Beside him walked Morgan, Wyatt, and a cane-carrying Doc Holliday. Groups came face to face in the tight alleyway. The air went completely silent. No one knew who pulled their trigger first, but suddenly, the alley erupted into a wall of smoke and fire. 30 shots were fired in less than 30 seconds, leaving 3 men dead and the ground stained red. But the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral did not bring. It triggered a brutal, bloody cycle of revenge that would push Wyatt Earp to the absolute brink of madness. But the law was not the only thing trying to tame the wild frontier. In the 1870s, a new beast of iron and steam was carving its way through the dirt. They called it the Iron Horse. Before the tracks arrived, if you wanted to leave, you risked your life on a bumpy, slow stagecoach. But the railroad changed the rules of time and space overnight. For the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads, this was a golden empire waiting to be snatched. Every mile of track laid meant massive federal land grants and built at a breakneck, deadly pace. In towns like Promontory Summit in Utah, the stakes could not have been higher. The workers were mostly desperate immigrants, including thousands of brave Chinese laborers. They blasted through solid granite mountains with highly unstable nitroglycerin. One wrong move, one sudden slip of the foot, and an entire crew vanished in a flash of smoke. But the bosses did not care about the body count, they only cared about the speed. On May 10, 1869, the tracks finally met in a historic clash of iron. They drove a ceremonial golden spike into the ground to join the nation. Agonizing months to just 6 days. Boomtowns that were once dying for supplies were suddenly flooded with cheap goods. You could now order a piano from Chicago or find silk from New York directly to the desert. But the railroad was a double-edged sword for the West. While it brought wealth and connection, it also brought the end of an ancient way of life. The tracks sliced directly through the sacred hunting grounds of the Native Americans. To the Plains tribes, the roaring metal machine was a mechanical monster screaming through their home. And the railroad companies wanted the buffalo gone to protect their tracks and starve the tribes. Hunters boarded the trains with high-powered rifles, shooting the animals from the windows. Millions of majestic bison were reduced to rotting bones in the grass. With the buffalo gone, the tribes were forced onto barren reservations, their freedom stolen. Yet, the iron tracks kept multiplying, spreading like a spider web across the map. New towns popped up every 10 miles just to feed water to the thirsty steam engines. These were called hell-on-wheels towns, built overnight and packed with tents, saloons, and gamblers. They followed the end of the track, moving every time the rails pushed forward. When the construction crews left, these temporary towns died just as fast as they were born. But for the towns that secured a permanent station, the future looked golden and limitless. Cattle ranchers in Texas realized they could now drive their herds north to the railheads. In places like Abilene and Dodge City, Kansas, the arrival of the railroad meant pure chaos. Millions of longhorns were packed into wooden cattle cars, destined for the meatpacking plants of Chicago. The dusty cowboys who drove them finally had pockets full of cash and a desire to wild out. The quiet railroad hubs turned into absolute combat zones of booze, bullets, and betrayals. Tide of lawlessness. But as the smoke cleared from the latest saloon shootout, a new and far more terrifying threat was quietly riding into town on those very same tracks. By the late 1870s, the battle for the American West was no longer fought with cavalry and bows, but with silver mines and steam shovels. In the high-altitude desert of Butte, Montana, a barren hill of red dirt was about the home of the Copper Kings, where men fought hand-to-hand in dark tunnels thousands of feet beneath the pine forests. The prize was copper, the dull red metal that suddenly became more valuable than gold because of a man named Thomas Edison. Edison's new electric light bulb required millions of miles of copper wire to light up the cities of the East Coast. Marcus Daly, an Irish immigrant with dirt under his fingernails, realized this before anyone else. Deeper than his rivals, and hit a mountain of solid copper. But to the east, a wealthy young Easterner named William Andrews Clark had already bought up most of the land in Butte. Clark was elegant, cold, and possessed a fortune that could buy entire state legislatures. The rivalry between Daly and Clark would plunge the entire state of Montana into a decade of corruption and violence. It was a war fought in the dark, where miners from both sides met in the depths of the earth. To stop Clark's men from digging into his veins of copper, Daly's miners built underground brick walls to block the shafts. Clark's men responded by drilling holes through the brick and pouring barrels of slaked lime down on Daly's workers. The chemical reaction filled the tunnels with toxic, burning gas, blinding the miners in the dark. In retaliation, Daly's crew lowered giant steam pipes into the tunnels and blasted their rivals with dynamite, and bare knuckles in the suffocating heat of the deep earth. Above ground, the war was fought with suitcases of cash in the state capital of Helena. Clark wanted to be a United States Senator, a position that at the time was chosen by state legislators rather than voters. Clark simply bought the votes he needed, handing out envelopes containing $10,000 to Daly spent his own fortune to expose the bribery, leading to a massive Senate investigation in Washington, D.C. The scandal shocked the nation and eventually led to the passage of the 17th Amendment, changing how senators were elected forever. But the underground wars in the West were not limited to the copper mines of Montana. In the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, a quiet mining camp named Leadville was about to explode into chaos. A man named Horace Tabor had spent years running a tiny grocery store, trading flour for worthless mining claims. One day, two prospectors he had grub-staked dug into a hill and found a massive vein of silver. Almost overnight, Tabor became one of the richest men in the United States, earning $4,000 every single day. He divorced his devout, hard-working wife and married a beautiful young woman named Baby Doe, creating a national scandal. Tabor built grand opera houses in the wilderness and wore suits with buttons made of solid gold. But the silver barons of Colorado did not realize that their entire empire was built on a fragile political illusion. In 1893, the federal government made a decision that would instantly destroy the economy of the West. With the passage of the Gold Standard Act, the government stopped buying silver, causing the price of the metal to collapse in a single afternoon. The mines of Leadville and Butte shut down their engines, leaving thousands of miners without work or food. And ended up working as a postmaster in the city he once owned. Yet, as the silver and copper wars faded into history, a new rush was quietly beginning in the dry hills of Southern California. A different kind of liquid wealth was bubbling to the surface, and it would dwarf any fortune made of metal. By 1881, the dust of Tombstone, Arizona, was choking the life out of anyone who dared to stand for the law. The boomtown had grown too fast, fueled by millions of dollars in silver extracted from the desert floor. But the wealth did not bring peace, it brought a deadly clash of cultures that was about to explode. On one side stood the cowboys, a loose band of outlaws, cattle rustlers, and thieves who ruled the territory with fear. On the other side stood Virgil Earp, the city marshal, alongside his brothers Wyatt and Morgan. The Earps represented law and predictable profits. The tension had been building for months, fueled by threats, stolen livestock, and sheer hatred. On the cold afternoon of October 26, 1881, the boiling point was finally reached. Virgil Earp deputized his brothers, along with a deadly, coughing dentist named Doc Holliday. Together, the four men walked down Fremont Street, their heavy overcoats concealing shotguns and pistols. They were heading toward a narrow, empty lot near the OK Corral. Waiting for them were Ike and Billy Clanton, alongside Frank and Tom McClory. The air was freezing, and the wind howled through the wooden buildings as the two groups came. Face to face. Virgil Earp raised his walking stick and shouted for the outlaws to throw up their hands. Instead, the click of cocking revolvers echoed through the narrow alley. What happened next lasted only 30 seconds, but it would echo through American history forever. 30 shots were fired in a blinding flurry of black powder smoke and deafening blasts. Billy Clanton fell to the ground, desperately firing his gun with his boots kicking in the dirt. Frank McClory took a bullet to the head and collapsed onto the cold gravel. Tom McClory was shredded by Doc Holliday's shotgun blast and stumbled into the street, dying. When the smoke cleared, 3 outlaws lay dead or dying in the freezing dirt. Virgil and Morgan Earp were seriously wounded, but they were still standing. Wyatt Earp stood completely untouched, without a single scratch on his long coat. The fight at the OK Corral was over, but the war for Tombstone had only just begun. The cowboys wanted blood for their fallen brothers, and they did not care about the law. Just 2 months later, Virgil Earp was ambushed in the dark and shot in the back, leaving him crippled for life. Then, in March of 1882, Morgan Earp was shot through a saloon window while playing billiards. He died in Wyatt's arms, his blood. Earp realized that the local courts would never convict the men who killed his brother. So, he decided to write his own laws using lead and gunpowder. Wyatt gathered a small posse of trusted men and embarked on what became known as the Earp Vendetta Ride. They rode through the Arizona mountains, hunting down every single man suspected of Morgan's murder. One by one, the outlaws were tracked down and executed in the wilderness. Wyatt personally shot Frank Stillwell at a Tucson train station, leaving his body riddled with bullet holes. The Vendetta Ride turned Wyatt Earp from a lawman into a wanted fugitive, hunted by his own government. But it also broke. Lawlessness was coming to a bloody end. Across the West, other boomtowns were watching Tombstone, realizing that raw violence could not sustain a community. To attract families, schools, and real investments, these wild cities had to tame their streets at any cost. In Montana, vigilante committees formed to hang road agents from the nearest pine trees without a trial. In Kansas, legendary lawmen like Bat Masterson used iron fists to keep the peace in cattle towns. The wild, lawless frontier was being suffocated by the arrival of the telegraph, the railroad, and the judge. Yet, just as the dust began to settle in Arizona, a new and far more terrifying threat was rising from the deep mountain passes of the north. By the late 1870s, the silver veins of Virginia City, Nevada, were no longer screaming with wealth. Deep inside the Comstock Lode, the drill struck nothing but hot water and barren rock. Superintendents stared at the daily assay reports in absolute silence. Big Bonanza, which had pumped out over $100 million in silver, was finally running dry. But the mining barons could not let the public know. If the Wall Street investors realized the silver was gone, the stock market would collapse overnight. And the stamps crushing worthless rock to create the illusion of prosperity. Down in the dark, shift bosses whispered the grim truth to one another. The miners began to notice the shift. Paychecks were suddenly delayed by a day, then a week. The local merchants in Virginia City stopped accepting credit. People started watching the stagecoaches very closely. They were looking for the heavy iron strongboxes that usually carried the silver bullion to the trains. But the boxes leaving the mills were suspiciously light. In 1881, the Great Yellow Jackets of the Comstock began to lay off men by the dozens. The panic was no longer quiet. It was a cold, hard reality. Men packed their canvas bags in the middle of the night. They did not say goodbye to their neighbors. They just walked down the dusty road toward the train station. Real estate values in the crown jewel of the West plummeted to zero in a matter of months. Mansions that cost $20,000 to build were sold. The Grand Opera House, where international stars once sang for miners throwing gold coins, fell silent. Over in Bodie, California, the exact same tragedy was playing out. The Standard Consolidated Mine had carried the town for years, but the gold simply vanished from the quartz. By 1882, the population of Bodie shrank from 10,000 swung in the wind, creaking on rusted hinges. The local newspaper, the Bodie Free Press, ran out of ink and paper. The editor printed his final issue on wrapping paper from the butcher shop. It warned that the end of the Golden West was near. Families left their fully set dinner tables, leaving plates and cups behind as if they expected to return tomorrow. But they never did. The desert was reclaiming what had been stolen from it. The great machinery that had shook the earth for 2 decades slowly ground to a halt. The steam boilers grew cold. The silence that followed was deafening to those. The desperate stayed behind, hunting for scraps in the ruins of empires. They searched the tailings piles for any speck of missed metal. But the earth had given up its treasures, and it was closed for business. Across the west, the maps of Nevada, California, and Arizona were suddenly littered with the corpses of settlements. These were the ghost towns. But as the lights went out in the mountains, a new and far more dangerous threat was brewing on the open plains. The town of Aspen, Colorado, was breathing its last shallow breaths. The Grand Wheeler Opera House, which once echoed with the voices of European soprano singers, stood dark and freezing under the mountain shadow. Inside the empty saloons, the mahogany bars were covered in a thick layer of gray dust. Mine owners like Jerome B. Wheeler realized that the silver boom was not just slowing down, it was completely dead. Wheeler looked out his office window at the quiet gallows. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act was about to be repealed, and the federal government would no longer buy the metal that built this mountain empire. Word of the impending economic collapse spread through the cabins like a cold draft. Miners who had spent a decade digging into the dark earth realized their paper money was suddenly worthless. The great exodus did not happen with a slow, organized retreat. Hundreds of families packed what little they could carry into wooden trunks and headed for the train depot. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad station was overwhelmed by a desperate, pushing crowd. People traded valuable silver pocket watches and heirloom jewelry just for a single ticket heading east. Those who could not afford a ticket simply started walking down the rugged mountain passes on foot. As the crowd fled, a strange, heavy silence fell over the residential districts of the town. But the silence did not last long. In the nearby town of Creede, Colorado, the desperation turned into something far more destructive. With the mines closed, desperate men turned to cheap whiskey and angry blame. On a dry, windy night, a single knocked-over kerosene lamp in a local parlor house ignited the wooden boardwalks. Within minutes, the dry pine buildings of Creede were engulfed in a massive wall of fire. There was no water pressure in the pipes, as the water utility company had abandoned the town just days prior. Miners and merchants watched in absolute horror as their entire life savings turned into ash before their eyes. The famous Bob Ford, the man who killed Jesse James, saw his own Creede saloon burn to the ground in the blaze. The fire consumed over 30 business blocks, leaving nothing but charred chimneys standing like tombstones. For many, this was the final sign that the gods of the frontier had completely abandoned them. They packed their wagons with whatever survived the flames and joined the long trail of refugees. As the settlers marched away, they left behind towns that were frozen in time. In the hurry to leave, tables were left set with ceramic plates, and heavy iron stoves were left cold but intact. The desert wind of Nevada and the mountain snow of Colorado began their long, slow work of reclaiming the land. Sagebrush grew through the floorboards of the grandest hotels in Bodie. And bullion now held only dry autumn leaves. By 1895, over 100 thriving boomtowns across the West had been completely depopulated. The wild, chaotic era of instant millionaires and lawless mountain empires had vanished into the mountain mist. The people who had conquered the wilderness were gone, leaving only wooden skeletons behind. The final, dark secret remained buried deep inside the flooded shafts of the deepest mines. By the late 1890s, the once deafening roar of the American West had faded into a haunting silence. The high-stakes gamble of the frontier was over, leaving behind a scarred landscape of empty saloons and rotting gallows. In Bodie, California, the bustling metropolis of 10,000 souls shrunk to just a handful of stubborn residents. Wind howled through the cracked windows of the Methodist Church, built in 1882, where miners once prayed for gold. The wooden sidewalks that once shook with the heavy boots of outlaws now lay buried under layers of dry Sierra Nevada dust. Over in Tombstone, Arizona, the legendary Birdcage Theater finally closed its doors in 1892, sealing its secrets inside. The stage where Doc Holliday played poker and Wyatt Earp drank whiskey was covered in heavy drapes and thick spiderwebs. Nature was aggressively reclaiming what man had built in a desperate, short-lived frenzy. In the abandoned mining camp of Bannack, Montana, the freezing winters warped the sturdy pine frames of the local courthouse. The grand dreams of overnight millionaires were reduced to warped floorboards and rusted iron nails. Locomotives that once brought eager prospectors by the thousands now bypassed these dying settlements altogether. The steel rails that connected the boomtowns to the modern world began to rust under the vast, uncaring western sky. By 1900, the United States Census officially declared that the American frontier was closed. The line between the civilized East and the wild, untamed West had completely vanished. Great corporations bought up the remaining mines, replacing the rugged individual prospector with low-wage industrial laborers. The era of the lone gunfighter and the lucky gold pan striker was dead. But the stories of these silent wooden giants did not entirely disappear into the dust. They became frozen capsules of a time when men risked everything for a single glitter in the dirt. Today, the dry desert air of places like Rhyolite, Nevada, preserves the skeletal remains of three-story concrete buildings. These ruins stand as monument structures to human greed, ambition, and the relentless march of time. Visitors who walk these empty streets can almost hear the phantom echoes of laughter, gunfire, and clinking glasses. They remind us that the glittering promise of the American dream can vanish just as quickly as it arrived. The wild frontier had finally been tamed, leaving behind only the beautiful, tragic ghosts of the boomtowns.